and welcome to another video. So today's video I'm going to be talking about another camera from the 1930s, and this camera is a camera that was made in Germany starting before World War II. The camera is this camera right here. This is a Wirgin Edinex camera, sold here in the US as the Midget Marvel. And the reason for that name will become obvious as I talk about the camera in a little more detail. So to just kind of go over some of the basics of the camera, it is a 35mm camera that takes standard 35mm cassettes. The camera was introduced in 1936 in the US, which I think was the same year that it was introduced in Germany. Very small camera, and again I'll get into the size of the camera in a little more detail a little later in the video. But some of the basic features, like I said, it's a 35mm camera. It has a collapsible lens mount, so when you're walking around with the camera, it is extremely small. And then to take pictures, you extend the lens out on its little stalk, lock that into position, and then all of the controls are on the shutter body itself, which is the component that sits at the end of the lens stock. So there's no linkage connection between the shutter control and the camera body, which helps simplify the mechanism and keep it very small. Now, being a camera that was designed in the 1930s, before there was a lot of standardization to 35mm camera design, it has some fairly proprietary features. So first of all, the accessory shoe on the top of the camera is actually a post mount, which was an accessory connection that was modeled after the early Leica cameras. So it can take like the Leica accessory rangefinder. There is no rangefinder on this camera, which also contributes to it being a very small camera. It just has a simple Galilean type viewfinder to help frame your image, but all of the distance measuring has to be done by guessing or by using an external rangefinder. Now, the camera, like many cameras of its era, was produced in a wide range of quality levels. So this particular model has a rather slow lens, an f4.5 lens. They did make lenses up to, I think, f2, which was obviously very fast for that era. This has a little bit better shutter on it though than the bottom of the range. This has the Prontor 2, which offers 8 speeds plus bulb and time. Now, I've been trying to figure out exactly what year this model is from. I know it's pre-war because it has features that were found only on the earliest models. For example, it has the early rewind and wind knobs that have a distinctive knurling that the later models did not have. Like I said before, it has the post style accessory shoe, which was only found in the early models. And the shutter itself being a Prontor 2, I believe those shutters were only produced prior to World War II. Now I'll get into the history of the camera a little bit more. It is kind of an interesting camera in terms of its history, but before I do that, let's load up a roll of film and take it out shooting. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the size of the camera, and like I said, it is quite small. So here you can see, compared to an Olympus XA, which is of course famously small, it's about the same height and just a little bit wider. And then if we compare it to a Nikon EM, which is quite a small 35mm SLR, you can see it's much smaller than even the small Nikon EM. And then lastly, if we compare it to its contemporary 35mm counterpart, the Contax II, which was produced the same year, it is significantly smaller. Now, granted, the Contax II has a rangefinder on top, but even accounting for that, the Edinex is quite a bit smaller, certainly narrower and shorter. So when we start looking at the background of the camera, I'll have to admit there's not a lot of information online, and what little information there is tends to be quite contradictory. When I give information on my channel, I like to make sure that I have strong reference material to work from, so that I'm not just misquoting information that's been regurgitated and not verified. So I'm going to keep this fairly brief and just stick to information that can be verified. So the Wirgin brothers had a company that they had started sometime in the 1920s, and by the mid-1920s were producing cameras under their Wirgin brothers name. Now, like I mentioned earlier, they released the Edinex camera in 1935 in Europe, and 1 year later, 1936, it was released in the US as the Midget Marvel. But just 2 years later, the situation in Germany was becoming dire, and for the Wirgin brothers, who were of Jewish descent, they chose to leave Germany and immigrate to the US in 1938. Now, the Wirgin brothers' camera manufacturing plant was taken over by Adox, and Adox began producing the same camera, marketing it as the Adox Adretta. They did add one feature to the camera, which was an opening back, which made loading the camera quite a bit easier, and that feature was continued post-war on the Edinex cameras that followed World War II. Now, after the war ended, Heinrich Wirgin, who had changed his first name to Henry when he emigrated to the US, returned to Germany and was able to purchase back the factory that Adox had taken over during World War II. And so the Wirgin brothers were able to restart their camera manufacturing in Germany shortly after World War II ended. Then from the late 1940s through the 1950s, they continued to manufacture the Edinex camera in a variety of different forms. In the early 1950s, they updated the top plate of the camera to include a more modernized housing for the viewfinder, although it continued to be a rangefinder-less camera. They also produced a rangefinder version of the camera later in the 1950s, and somehow continued to sell these cameras up through the 1960s. I have in my collection of camera literature a catalog from 1965 that still continues to list brand new Edinex camera outfits for sale. Unbelievably, 30 years after the camera was first introduced. So just a few closing thoughts on this camera, and then we'll finish up this video. The camera was surprisingly sharp. You can see in this image here that the lens, even though it was a very small amount of glass and just a lowly f4.5 lens, can produce very sharp results. I was also surprised by how contrasty some of the images were, particularly when facing away from the sun. Now, obviously, facing toward the sun, the contrast suffered quite a bit, but I was pleasantly surprised with the output of this camera. So with that, I will wrap up the video, and thanks again for joining me for this video, and stay tuned for another one in coming weeks. Bye for now.